Okay, thanks to COVID, we had to stop after the first lesson on Joshua series. And then Lynn so greatly, he just jumped right in and he did a series in Ephesians, and I'm thankful for him. He did a wonderful job. He told me the other day, he says, I am ready to stop teaching for a while. So I guess he wants us to make this last a good long time. You can always tell when he's ready to get back in the saddle because he starts saying, well, when are you going to be done? Anyway, so we've been in a hiatus here for a few weeks. So I just wanted to, once again, for those of you who are unfamiliar, where are we? This is the chart of world history. We are in the second millennium before Christ, halfway between Abraham and David. And that would put us right here around 1450. And then 40 years of wilderness wandering. Joshua then takes command and they begin the ascent into Israel, the promised land, and the Battle of Jericho. Now, last time we talked a little bit about the context geographically. I really don't need to go over too much of that. If you recall, they left Sukkot in Egypt, came all the way over to Mount Sinai, took about 2 months. And then they went from Mount Sinai after a year, during which God gave them the law. They built the tabernacle. They traveled up to Kadesh Barnea, which was to be the entry point into the promised land. And for those of you who were in the service this morning, Kyle preached a great message on the spies who went in there. Of course, they failed, and God condemned them to wander in the wilderness for 40 years. And they actually wandered between Kadesh and the head of the Gulf of Aqaba, probably over in this region for 40 years, actually 38 years. And then they moved out, past Edom and Moab, and spent 2 years in the conquest of 2 Amorite kings, bringing them to the plains of Moab, which is where Joshua begins. Now, the first mention that we have of Joshua, the actual place we encounter him in the biblical narrative, is at Rephidim. Rephidim was the last place that they camped before they reached the final site of Mount Sinai, okay? Rephidim was where the water came out of the rock. And that was where the Amalekites attacked the Israelis as they traveled in. I remember the Israeli caravan had to be something on the order of 10 or 15 miles long. And there's a lot of people, a lot of cattle and so forth. And the Amalekites were essentially raiders. Their job was to go out and find caravans and villages and destroy them and kill the people and keep their stuff. That was very common in that day. In fact, David, we're told, while he was living in Ziklag and serving the Philistine king, would go out and do that very thing. He would attack a village of some other tribe, and he would destroy men, women, children, and he would keep all their stuff. And that was how they made a living. It's just a barbaric, it seems to us, but that was very common in that day. Now, let's pick it up. We're going to probably not get through Joshua 1 for a couple of weeks for a couple of reasons, and I'll tell you what they are. But let's just read the place where Joshua first comes into the picture. Jack, we want to read Exodus 17, 8 and 9.
The Amalekites came and attacked the Israelites at Rephidim. Moses said to Joshua, choose some of our men and go out to fight the Amalekites. Tomorrow I will stand on top of the hill with the staff of God in my hands.
Okay. The Amalekites came and they attacked. Actually, it tells us later in Deuteronomy, they attacked the stragglers, which is what you'd expect from these guys. And so they decided to fight back. And who's placed in charge of the army? Well, Joshua. What kind of an army was this? These are a bunch of slaves. Well, sheep herders and people who had become slaves in the last 30 to 50 years and didn't have a lot of military knowledge. Where'd they get their weapons, by the way? Anybody know? Anyone know where they might get their weapons?
The Egyptians.
Couldn't hear that?
Egyptians.
I can't hear.
From the Egyptians, she said.
From the Egyptians, right. Remember, not everybody recognizes this, but when the Egyptians were crossing the Red Sea between the water walls, they got about halfway or a little more behind the Israelis. They were going to attack them, and the wheels fell off the chariots and everything. And they said, oh my goodness, God is fighting for his people. And they turned around on foot and they started running back. And it says that the water collapsed as they were running into it, which means that some 1,000 feet of water collapsed from west to east. And imagine this now. You're running like crazy to get away from these guys. And all of a sudden, all this water comes at you and killed every one of you. But what did it do to them and their weapons? It washed them up on the eastern shore. And it says in the Song of Moses that they walked along the shore and they saw the Egyptian bodies and their weapons. And so that's where they got them. Kind of an interesting sidelight. Piece of trivia you might want to remember if you want to impress your grandkids. Anyway, but here we go. He's at Moses' side. He is the head of the army. He's leading the army. Now, that means Joshua was not a nobody, was he? He didn't just pop out of nowhere. How long has it been since they left Sukkot? If they're just about at Sinai. Anybody know? 2 months. We figure it took about a week and a half, maybe a week, on a forced march to cross the Sinai, and then they went south and crossed the Red Sea, and then it took them a little while longer. And so he's been 2 months on the road, and now he's in charge of the army. Well, what about before that? How long was it that Moses was actually in Egypt and the whole thing with the plagues and Pharaoh took place? How long would you think that would be? Anybody got an idea? You guys are full of guesses here. I think it's about a year. It looks like it's about a year. So at the most, Joshua could have known Moses for no more than 1 year and 2 months. So that's a lot. We sometimes think of him as a young man. And how did he get catapulted to this spot? Moses makes him his aide. And we get a few hints about that in Numbers 13. I won't go there, but Numbers 13 is where they talk about the spies going into Canaan. That's what Kyle spoke about today. And it says that it lists all of the princes from the tribe. So there were 12 spies, one from each tribe, and it says that they should choose leaders of the tribes, princes. The Hebrew word is nasi, the prince of the tribe. So Joshua is a prince of the tribe of Ephraim, which was one of the largest tribes. So he was not a nobody. In fact, he may well have been a bit of a leader in the tribal councils, I think. His name that's written in that chapter is his tribal name, his original name, which is Hoshea. Interesting. It wasn't Joshua, it was Hoshea. Now, anybody know what Hoshea means?
Jesus saves, I think.
Nope. No. Hoshea means desire for salvation. Now, think about that for a minute. Desire for salvation. I think Joshua was a firebrand. Okay? And you got to kind of get the picture. They were not in Egypt 430 years. They were in Egypt about half of that time. The sojourn refers to the time Abraham and the patriarchs sojourned in Canaan and Egypt. And then after that, when Jacob came down and relocated, they sojourned the rest of that time in Egypt. So they spent about 215 years in Egypt. And what was it in Exodus that got the Pharaoh so concerned about them? The number, right. In other words, their population was taken off, wasn't it? Well, that doesn't happen in 10 years. I mean, if they went down with 70 people, they had to have some time that they lived in prosperity and in the favor of the Pharaoh, and of course with Joseph, until Joseph died. So these things don't take place overnight. And I reproduced the chart that we used back in the Moses series to show you at 5 live births per woman, which was about in the middle of what we could expect at a time like that. It would take about 180, 190 years for this thing to really take off. So if you think about that, there was a well-developed nation, or not a nation, but a tribal government. There were tribal councils. Joshua was a prince among these, and they had descended or had been reduced by government action into slavery for maybe no more than 30 to 50 years ago, which means there were a lot of people alive who remembered those years. And people would have understandably really desired to be set free of it. And I see him as a young man, a rising star, a prince in Ephraim, and he is wanting out. He wants to be saved, right? Now, Remember, when Moses was at the burning bush, God told him to go back to Egypt. Who did he meet on the way?
Aaron.
Aaron, that's right. What was Aaron doing in Midian?
Well, God told him to go out there and see his brother.
I don't think God told him to do that. I think that the councils decided we need someone to help us out here. And I imagine Joshua, being a strong activist and an advocate for freedom, said, we need a leader, and I know just the guy. He's out there in Midian, I've heard. Aaron, he's your brother. Go on out and get him. Well, at the same time that God's talking to Moses, the Joshua and the leaders of Israel are talking to Aaron, and they send him out. And of course, all in the providence of God. Okay? So I got a feeling he was one of those. And so when Moses arrived in Egypt, he wasn't arriving to a person who was unknown. He would have known him as a player. And he may have seen him as a rising star, a strong advocate for freedom. And so he took him to be his aide. Now, one of the first things he did, I believe, is he changed his name. In Numbers chapter 13, verse 16. You want to read that for us, Jack?
These are the names of the men Moses sent to explore the land. Parentheses, Moses gave Hoshea, son of Nun, the name Joshua.
Okay, so Hoshea, he who desires salvation, Moses changes his name at the outset to Joshua or Yeshua, which means the Lord Yahweh is salvation. And so from the very start, Moses focuses this firebrand, this leader, this rising star's attention on the fact that it is not you that's going to save any more than it was me when I was back here. It is God himself who will save us. And he focused his attention on Yahweh, on the Lord. So that is the beginning. Now, yes, the question of his age, I often wondered about that. He could have been in his 20s. He could have been in his 50s. It's very hard. You kind of have to bracket it a little bit. Joshua 24:29 tells us that he finally died at the age of 110. And this was after the conquest, and he had dwelt for some time in peace. So I'm going to put about 35 on it, all right? About 35 years old. And if that's the case, he died at 110. He would have been 35 when he left Egypt. He wandered for 40 years in the wilderness and 1 year at Mount Sinai. What does that leave? That's why you always should study the Bible with a calculator. Spoken as an engineer. So 110 minus 41 minus 35 equals 34 years. Now give the conquest, the main conquest under Joshua to be about 10 years. And then he spent about 24 years serving as the first of the judges and the leader of the nation. Now, the interesting thing is that would make him, when we started, about 76. Alvin.
Exodus 4:27. Now the Lord said to Aaron, go to meet Moses in the wilderness.
All right, I agree with you on that.
I knew it was too.
But I don't think that the Lord necessarily didn't use the people in the tribal government as well. All right? How did he speak to him? Well, he spoke. I just don't see him going.
When did you create your own version?
I could create my own version. That's right. That's right. All right. So how old is he going to be at the beginning of the conquest? He's 76. Isn't that interesting? How old was Moses when he went back to Egypt?
80-ish.
He was 80.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I would put Joshua about 76. He could be 80. He could be 70. But the point is, he wasn't a spring chicken. There's just no way that you can sandwich this in such a way that he would be a younger man. So this tells you, if God gives you a task and you're older, and of course that applies to most of us, he can still use you. And we shouldn't be afraid to do what he asks us to do. Now, one of the things you have to ask yourself the question is, where did this guy come from? How did he get prepared? Even though he may have been a leader, he was a prince of Ephraim. That is specifically stated. We know that. Moses changed his name and all those things. He was his aide from the very beginning. But there was a lot left for him to learn. And I would like to perhaps go over that this week and next on the major events in Joshua's life through which God instructed him on 15 principled life lessons. And it would seem to me that after Joshua had absorbed those lessons, he was ready to do the task that God had given him. And it seems to me also that we might be able to learn from that a little bit. Now, it's interesting the way you can divide them up. Prior to the battle at Rephidim, there was about 3 lessons. After the battle, another 3. The covenant meal on the mountain, 3. In connection with the golden calf rebellion, 3 more. In personal character issues at Sinai and Kadesh was 3. And before his ordination before the assembly, which tells us something as well. Now to get an idea of what those were, so as we're going to go through them, prior to Rephidim, he learned about the power and sovereignty of God, the leadership of God, how to follow him, the provision of God, how he takes care of us. At the battle of Rephidim, which we'll cover today, he learned about God as a warrior. He learned about God as judge and avenger. And he learned about his responsibility, our responsibility, to join God in his battles. Then at the covenant meal on the mountain, he learned about the reality of God, the glory of God, and the fellowship of God. And then in connection with the golden calf, he learned a little bit about the depravity of man, how quickly we descend into sin, and the destructiveness of sin to the people and the nation, and then the need for power in a sinful world. We'll talk about that as well. On personal character issues, he had to learn the importance of intimacy with God, and then selfless servant leadership, which Moses modeled before him, but then also courage under fire. Those are the lessons that we're going to go through. I think that you could say Joshua's struggles and these lessons are our lessons of life writ large, right? I mean, there's none of us leading the Israelites to conquer the Canaanites, right? We're not doing great deeds like that. We don't head up a nation, but we head a family. We may have a small group. We may have responsibilities in our business and people that look to us. And in many ways, these are the same lessons that we need to learn ourselves. So we do want to learn them as we go through the events that he participated in by the will of God. So let's take the first. However he got started, okay, he learned one vitally important lesson with Moses, okay? And that lesson is that God's power is supreme and his will is irresistible. Remember, what did he see? He saw the humiliation, and I mean the humiliation of the most powerful man in the world. The greatest civilization, the greatest nation in the entire world at that time was brought low by the power of God. God said, I want my people out of there, and there was nothing Pharaoh could do to stop it. I also think he must have seen Moses stand in front of this man and not berate him, but dictate to him what the Lord God intended. Let my people go. Well, remember, the Pharaoh could have simply nodded. He could have flicked his finger and there would have been a dozen spears stuck through him. I mean, it was nothing for someone to be killed right in front of the Pharaoh, right there, instantly. He had the power of life and death. And yet Moses stood up and told Pharaoh exactly what God had told him to say. And it could not have escaped Joshua that he was protected in all that. For some reason, the Pharaoh didn't act. The Pharaoh didn't. You ever wonder why the Pharaoh didn't kill him? That's a good question, isn't it? And it could really, yes, Alvin.
Remember what Jesus said under Pilate? You would have no authority over me at all unless God gave it to you.
Yes, that's right down here at the bottom of the page. We'll get to that in a second. Well, figure out what are the implications for Joshua of this when he goes and he looks at Canaan, when he went in with the spies. What would this implication be for him? How would that affect him? Would he be afraid to conquer Canaan? Yeah.
If he had seen what Moses did with the Pharaoh, I think he would have thought, what can Canaan do against us? I mean, they're nothing compared to what happened in Egypt.
Exactly. You're making an argument from the greater to the lesser. In Romans 8, we're given the same argument. He who did not spare his own son, but gave him up for us all, how will he not also give us all things? You ever notice that? Thank you. Freely give us all things.
Watch out.
How isn't that a great argument? If God will do that for me, will he not also do this? If God will destroy Pharaoh and Egypt, will he not also give us Canaan? That's why Joshua didn't see any reason in the world not to invade Canaan. I don't care about the giants. I don't care about the walled cities. God can do anything. And he was able to recognize that God, his power is supreme. And God's admonition in the very first chapter of Joshua, the first admonition, anybody know what that was? That he said, God said to him something very important. He said it several times over.
Do not be afraid.
Do not be afraid.
Yeah, be courageous. Do not be afraid.
Be courageous,
The
right.
Lord, your God goes with you.
That's right. Be strong and courageous. So even though he had seen the destruction of Egypt, he had seen the crossing of the Red Sea, he had seen all the wandering in the wilderness and the wonderful things God had done, God still felt it necessary to say, be strong, be courageous. Strong, important lesson. What's the implication for us?
To be strong and courageous. I believe God has it. He'll be with us.
Okay? If God, our God, is supreme in power, and if his will is irresistible, and you and I are in his will, what's the implication of that? Well, it's just what Alvin said a minute ago. He said, no one can do anything to the one that is in the center of the will of God. This is why many missionaries that go out, you'll get young families that are going to go out into the Muslim world, and you say, you can't do that. This is a dangerous thing. How many parents have said that? And what is their answer? If we are in the middle of God's will, nothing can happen to us. That's exactly what Jesus said to Pilate. He said, you would have no power over me were it not given to you from above. So we really have to understand that God's sovereignty is our security. And our problem is very often we do not see God as great enough. We don't see, you've heard the phrase, your God is too small. God is sovereign. His will is irresistible. If I am in the center of his will, I need not fear anything. Not COVID, right? I mean, we've seen fear just right through this country to the point where it's irrational. And I heard an interview between Dennis Prager and another fellow, and they asking the question, why is it that religious people are less afraid than non-religious people? And the answer the guy gave, I thought was wonderful. He said, I think it's because we do not give death the last word. We have a God who is sovereign. He expects us to be responsible, but we shouldn't tremble under the kitchen table in fear. And if there's one thing that characterizes particularly the youngest among us in this nation today, is this huge epidemic of fear. I just sometimes contrast the songs that we sing on a Sunday morning compared to the songs that we sang when I was a kid. When I was a kid, we sang Onward Christian Soldiers, Marching Against War, with the cross of Jesus going on before. We said, one day when heaven, there's just all these wonderful stories that were joyful and powerful and said, God has done wonderful things for us. But so many of our songs today are talking about, I will not be afraid. And they speak to the fears of our people. Our God is too small. In being abandoned to his will, we can find a great deal of courage. Okay, second lesson, when God leads you into darkness, trust him and obey. And of course, the best example of that is the Red Sea, right? Remember that the goal for Moses, now Moses was a military man. He had commanded troops in battle. He was a tremendous leader. And he had passed this way at least twice before. He had gone from Egypt to Midian, which is over here, okay? And then he had gone back, so he knew the route. It's just a common route. Matter of fact, you can drive this route today, by the way. And so God had said, when you leave Egypt, you are to come to this mountain. So Moses' goal and his plan was, we're going to do a forced march day and night, and we're going to cross this area, and we are going to get to Elat and cross the Jordan Valley. And when we do, we're outside of Pharaoh's jurisdiction. We will take only the supplies that can get us to here, because we know once we get there, we can purchase food, we can get water, we can get all that we need, and we can get on this side of the border, and Pharaoh can't touch us. Pharaoh still ruled in this region. It wasn't part of Egypt proper, but he did. And so he's going along like this, and he stops here at the last camp before they get to Elat. And God says, turn south, and then camp by the sea. Wow. Moses knew the area. He knew what was going on. If you look at the map of this, or pull it up on Google Earth, this is nothing but mountains and dry riverbeds. And they go serpentine all through this area, and you could get lost in that maze. And so they went south, and they went through these wadis till they came to this beach. We talked about that, the Nuweiba Beach. It's got about 4 square miles, and there is one way in, and that's the same way out. There was no way to get out any other way. They're all covered with mountains. And of course, Pharaoh followed them, right? Moses knew this was going to happen. He knew that Pharaoh was going to follow. God told him so. And nevertheless, not knowing what God intended to do, he followed and he obeyed. Alvin.
Except at the last minute, God told him, quit dithering, and would you go on and start across? Because Moses at the last minute evidently was not doing
I don't think that's true. I think that he said, why are you crying out to me? Just go ahead. It's time to move. I don't think that Moses changed his mind. I think Moses knew that God was in control completely. And the Pharaoh's troops had come in. They had confronted. They were lining up to destroy the whole nation. God came between them. I don't think that Moses back here knew what God was going to do. I mean, think about that. Had anybody ever parted the waters of something as big as the Gulf of Aqaba? No. That was not even on the radar. That was not even in anybody's mind. You and I think about that because we know the story. But he was headed into darkness. And nevertheless, I could just imagine the conversation between Joshua and Moses. Are you crazy? You sure God told you that? You have to go down. We are sitting ducks. And I know Pharaoh's already left Sukkot himself, and he's on his way. He's just burning up the roads, coming after us. We're crazy. That's sure suicide. Yeah, but God has told us that's where he wants us to go. When God leads into darkness, trust him and obey. Now, Joshua ended up facing this sort of a situation at least 2 more times. And we're going to see that as we go through the book. At Gilgal and later on at Mount Ebal, when he exposed the entire army and the entire nation to utter destruction by their enemies. They were vulnerable. They were out there, and there was no way that they could defend themselves. And yet God led them there. And you think Joshua understood when God leads you into darkness and trouble, trust and obey. Sometimes God deliberately leads us into trouble. Is that true?
Yes.
I mean, in my situation back as a young man, when I got out of the Navy, I went into a business, thought I wanted to act in faith. I was going to do it for all the right reasons. We were going to honor the Lord. We were going to take care of family members. We were going to do wonderful things. Surely he'll give me success, yes? And for 4 years, we were ground to powder, slowly and surely, and as the industry changed, and we could not escape where we were. And we eventually had to close it, and I was absolutely destroyed with that. I mean, why would God do this? I never felt more certain that he was leading in that direction than I was then, and nevertheless, he led us into trouble and failure. And we've seen that other times in life too. Can God you have to ask that question, can God deliberately lead you into trouble and failure? Yeah, he can. He certainly can. Why would he do that? You know, we have that wonderful passage in Romans 8:28, all things work together for good to them that love God and are called according to his purpose. I think one of the problems that we have is that we don't understand what the word good means. See, God told Moses, he said, I'm going to put you down on that beach, and I'm going to, did he say deliver you? No. He said, I'm going to glorify my name. You see? The good is that God will glorify my name. Oftentimes we mistake that for happiness. All things work together for my happiness and for success. No, it works for good. Hebrews 11:13 32 to 38 is a, let me see if I can pull it up here real quick. It take a long time to read it all, so we won't. But this is the faith chapter. Remember the faith chapter? And you just want to be a man of faith or a woman of faith, don't you? He says, what shall I say? I don't have time to tell you about Gideon, Barak, Samson, Jephthah, David, Samuel, and the prophets. Through faith, they conquered kingdoms, administered justice, gained what was promised, who shut the mouths of lions, quenched the fury of the flames, and escaped the edge of the sword, whose weakness was turned to strength, who became powerful in battle and routed foreign armies. Hey, I'll take that. Yeah, hero of faith. I want to be a man of faith, right? Read the second half of that passage. He says, women, there were others who were tortured, refusing to be released so that they might gain a better resurrection. Some faced jeers and flogging, even chains and imprisonment. They were put to death by stoning. They were sawed in two. They were killed by the sword. They went about in sheepskins and goatskins, destitute, persecuted, and mistreated. The world was not worthy of them. They wandered in deserts and mountains, living in caves and in holes in the ground. I'm not sure I want to be a man of faith, right? So good means that God will be glorified. Now, here's a question for you. Is that good for you? I think that's a big question we all ask. Do I want God to be glorified in my life? Well, yeah, if I'm in the first half of that passage, I want God to be glorified in my life. Alvin again.
But at no point did he say he left them. He didn't.
I can't hear you.
Because at no point did he say he left them. Yes, no. Because God was with them in the middle of that. We can't interview them right now. Mm-hmm. But in heaven, we're going to talk to them. Yes, they lost everything. But they didn't lose their faith. They didn't lose their confidence in God.
Who didn't lose their confidence?
Those people that were being so terribly treated.
Oh, that's right. Oh, yes, of course. Yeah, absolutely. God was with them in all that. I agree with you. I just would say I'd rather be victorious than be destroyed. I mean, the martyr's crown is a great thing. I'm just not sure I want one. Nancy.
I think of Mary Jo Dennison, who used to be our wedding coordinator here at church, was dying of cancer over in the nursing home, and I visited her, and she knew that she was very close to death. And her words were, "Isn't it exciting? Just think, I'm going to be with Jesus." And she was saying that so that the staff heard it, everybody heard it. She had peace because she was allowing God to be glorified.
Mm-hmm. That's right.
But she was dying in pain.
Mm-hmm. In Psalm 37, it says, delight yourself in the Lord, and he will give you the desires of your heart. Does that mean I will get the Jaguar I've always wanted? No, what happens, it seems to me anyway, as I've gotten older, is he has changed my desires. Psalm 72 says, whom have I in heaven but you, and having you, I want nothing on this earth. You see, we begin to understand the eternal nature of God's working in our lives. And as Paul said, pray for me so that now, as always, whether by life or by death, Jesus will be glorified in my body. Yeah, by life or death. Maury.
And Jesus even said he was going to show through Paul how he would suffer for his sake. Mm-hmm. God already, his plan for Paul was that he would suffer. Yeah. Excuse me, I'm dry, sorry. But that he would suffer for his sake. And we don't want that part, but that is part.
Yeah, and sometimes God is glorified by our suffering. I agree. Many people who have suffered, and we prayed with many of you through those times, God is glorified. And that is good for us. Yes?
What was that song that you just said again?
72? 37 and 72. So now sometimes God will do amazing things to deliver us, won't he? It's not always a disaster. He will lead us into the dark and then show us something great, like opening the Red Sea. You see, he brought them to the limit of themselves. They were sitting there like sitting ducks. The army's coming to destroy them, and they were terrified. And then God opens up the Red Sea. You know, a friend of mine who had been a heroin addict for many years and was marvelously saved used to say to me, he said, we do not let God do we do not get to see God do the impossible because we are unwilling to put him in or let him put us in impossible situations. Let me say that again so I get it right. We do not often see God do the impossible because we won't let him put us in impossible situations. Yeah.
Well, this is what I'm praying for us, that God would open the Red Sea, because our country is actually doomed. And for Christians, we hold continually our faith in Christ. And I think he will do something miraculous if we pray. If I don't mean he'll restore the wickedness in our country, but for his people, he will show his power. And, you know, in 2 Chronicles 20, I think it is, it says, you know, we don't know what to do, but our eyes are on you.
Amen.
We don't know what to do, but our eyes are on him.
Yeah.
Because
I
we
think-
can't fix it.
I think one of the most common examples of that is our divorce culture. Now, divorce happens to many people, and God can forgive that as well, but he says he hates divorce. And I think I've spoken to men who are saying, you just don't understand what a terrible thing it is living with this woman. And I just can't take it anymore. We're just going to have to dissolve this marriage. You know, the one who says, we will persevere, let God keep me in an impossible situation, has a great chance of seeing God do miraculous things. And there are many people who've testified to that.
Yes.
And we miss his blessing when we walk off the stage and leave the field of battle, as sometimes the marriage is, and then you know, try to hide. No, God will take care of us and do great things. All right. Now, when they got across the Red Sea, they landed right about here. That's Nueva Beach right there. You can see it. And they land about here. That was only about 30 miles from what we think Sinai was, Jebel al-Lawz. And it's only about 30 miles away. And we know that they got here about 2 weeks after Sukkot. They couldn't, there was a day and night forced march. But it says that they arrived at Sinai 2 months. Well, what was happening for 6 weeks? All they had to do was go 30 miles. And nevertheless, God led them. And this is a fanciful account. I just kind of looked at where you might be able to take the caravan like that. And he had them stop at Marah and Elam and so forth and all these different places. But the point is that God did not take them directly to where they were going to go. It took over 6 weeks to go 30 miles. Moses knew the area well. Remember, he'd been a shepherd here for 40 years. He knew this area. And so I can imagine him again talking to Joshua, and Joshua says, where are we going? Where's this mountain you were talking about? And Moses is over there. Well, how far away? About 30 miles. Okay, where are we going? We're going that way. Why? Because that's where the cloud is. You see, that's where God's leading us. I'm a terrible salesman. I'm an engineer, not a salesman. But I was in the sales business for a while, international sales. And I went with an old, experienced hand who was the CEO of the company. And we sat at the table with this guy, and I had my little presentation book out there. And it told me all the features and benefits of our product. And, you know, he was passing the time of day with this guy. And so I would kind of push this little thing out. Let's get down to business, boss. And he would go like this. Push it away. And he told me later on, he said, sales, to get to to where you want to go, the shortest distance is rarely a straight line. You see, there are other things that have to be taken care of as we get there. And that's exactly what happened here. God wanted to teach them the lesson, where God leads, he will provide. You see, when God takes you out of your comfort zone and pulls you somewhere else, he's going to provide for you. You just need to know that that's where he's leading. They went to Marah. There was poisonous water there, and God cleansed the water. They went to Elam, where they desperately needed rest, and there were palm trees and water, and so they got a chance to rest. They went to the down around here and up to this desert of Sin, and then they ran out of food. And they were crying that they didn't have any food, and God provided manna and quail. And then they were able to continue, and they went all the way over here to Rephidim, which is on the opposite side of where they camped on Mount Sinai. And they were out of water. And God supplied water, but he supplied it in abundance. Now, a couple things I want to catch off of that. Number one, they waited till they complained. God waited until they complained to Moses. I mean, let's face it. They could have let that spring just be, God could have made it clean. Just provide water for you folks. No, he let it remain poisonous. And so the people came up, and you can just imagine they're out of water in the desert, and they're all upset. And they beg God, says, why won't you provide us with water? Why are you leading out here? And he waits until they do that. Why? In every case he does. He doesn't fix that problem. He doesn't fix this one or that one until they cry out to him. Why? Go ahead, Don.
Because they had already exhausted everything that was in their power to do it. And God was showing them that he was the source of all of it.
Mm-hmm. That's right. I think he wanted to show them that it mattered what they wanted, that he cared for them personally. In James chapter 4:26, he says, you have not because you ask not God. You don't ask me for what you want. And he wanted them to understand that. If you will simply ask me, I can provide for you. So it wasn't just a matter that he would provide wherever they were, but he would provide in response to their prayers, in response to their request. And he did it in rather improbable ways. Let's face it, Moses threw a piece of wood into this spring and it turned poisonous water into good water. Out here in the middle of nowhere, this dew came up on the ground. It was manna, and then they had all these quail flew overhead and dropped dead in front of them. Pretty unusual ways that God supplies. And I think there's a lot of stories here that could be told about how you wanted God to help you in a situation, and lo and behold, he did, but it wasn't the way you thought, right? Not the way we expected. And here at Rephidim, this is a unique one. God provided for them abundantly. The water that came out at that point was huge. And I think, before we get to Rephidim, there's a pattern here. This illustrates a pattern. The longer we walk in faith, the more abundant the life that God gives us. Is that true? The longer we walk with the Lord, the sweeter it is with him. If you read Bunyan's Pilgrim's Progress, Christian goes through all these trials and troubles. He goes through the Slough of Despond, the Wicket Gate. He goes through all these other things. He gets down and he fights with Apollyon. And, he's had a rough life. But as he gets along toward the end of his journey, which is to the celestial city, he spends some time with the shepherds. Remember that? And it's a sweet and blessed time. And then he goes down to the old folks on the shore of the river where they await the summons of God. And these are times that are peaceful. These are times that are rich. And I believe the longer you walk with the Lord, the more you get to see how he provided for you here, he provided for you there, and he did the unusual over here. Then you see, you just reap more and more and more of his abundant blessing. And I've talked to people, I remember in my business, young men that they didn't have a clue. And I said to them, if you will serve the Lord Jesus, if you will put your family squarely on that foundation, you will someday reap abundant blessing. And I'd say to them, guys, I'm reaping right now. I'm an old guy. And God has blessed me so much. You too should shoot for that. Trust in the Lord. He will provide for you wherever you go. Now let's talk about Rephidim really quickly. At Rephidim, they didn't have any water. And so Moses was told to go out and whack this rock. Now, there is a rock on that side of Jebel al-Lawz, and this is what it looks like. In fact, you can get a tour to take you there.
Yes.
Isn't that interesting?
Yeah, I was going to do it.
Were you going to do it?
Yeah, but they were full out.
They were full. Oh, cool, cool. Yeah, you can go see this rock. And we don't have a lot of time to talk about it, but it does say that God split that rock. Now, Psalm 78, 15 and 16. Jack, can you pick that up for us?
He split the rocks in the desert and gave them water as abundant as the seas. He brought streams out of a rocky crag and made water flow down like rivers.
Now, this is 6 stories high. Okay? It's huge. And it's got this big crack down the middle of it. And if you look at the rocks here, they look like they've been eroded by water. Who knows? But it says that the water as abundant as the seas flowed. In Isaiah 48, he says, he split the rock and water gushed out. Now just imagine that. Imagine this water just pouring out of this rock. Where would it have gone? Would have gone right down into this area. And I got a feeling that it created a large lake. And this is just pure speculation, as I am wont to do, that they may well have used this lake to care for the livestock. And the tent city was on the other side of the mountain where they lived. And God gave them the law and so forth. And so all of the animals and many of the other things, they would have been able to live around this. I don't know that that's the case. But here's the point. God supplied them with an abundant supply of fresh, cold water. Now, in the Bible, that phrase is often indicated by the word living. Living water. To a desert dweller, living water was the water that came up out of the ground from a spring. It was cold, it was fresh, it was clean. But most of the water that people used was collected during the rainy season, and it was held in cisterns. So it was warm, it was dank, and it wasn't always healthy, but that's the only water that they had. Jeremiah has something to say to us about that when he talks about Israel's God as the source of living water. Jeremiah 1:13, Jack?
The word of the Lord came to me again. What do you see? I see a boiling pot tilting away from the north, I answered.
That is not what we're looking for. Let's take a quick, something's wrong. Is it what?
Is it chapter 3?
Take a look. You know what I'm talking about? Cisterns in the water?
Yeah, where they turn their back.
Why don't you
on
read that
God.
for us, Mari? Thank you.
I can't find it this moment,
Oh.
but I think I know what it says. It says,
Oh, yeah.
you basically created cisterns of your own that can hold no water because
Yeah.
they turned their back on him and his cisterns of living water.
That's
Does
right.
that say that somewhere?
Yeah, you
Jeremiah
got it
3.
pretty close there.
3.
Jeremiah, is it chapter 3? I may have
Thought
got
it was
that wrong.
3.
No?
I have an amplified Bible. It's hard
Yeah.
to find things in here.
Well, I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time looking at it.
Sorry, I'll find
Here
it.
we go.
Yeah.
It is chapter 2.
2, sorry.
All right, verse 13.
Okay.
Oh,
Was it 3?
Jeremiah 1:13 is really Jeremiah 2:13. Okay. My people have committed 2 sins.
That's right.
They have forsaken me, the spring of living water, and they've dug their own cisterns, broken cisterns that cannot hold water.
Amen.
See? Is that, you talk about trouble in our country, is that what we've done?
Yes.
We have forsaken the source of living water, of life itself, and we have dug our own cisterns, but even those cisterns don't hold much water. Living water. Jesus talks about it. He says, well, excuse me. He's speaking to the woman at the well in John chapter 4, verses 10 and 13 to 14. Jack, give us that?
Yeah, I've got it. Jesus answered her, if you knew the gift of God and who it is that asks you for a drink, you would have asked him and he would have given you living water. Jesus answered, everyone who drinks this water will be thirsty again, but whoever drinks the water I give him will never thirst. Indeed, the water I give him will become in him a spring of water welling up to eternal life.
In 1 Corinthians 10, Paul tells us that rock is a picture of Christ,
Yes.
right? He provides us life that is truly life. Speaking to the woman of the well, he says, I provide you with living water. To a desert dweller, living water is life, isn't it? And John 10:10, Jesus says, I've come that they might have life and that they might have it more abundantly. And that's what that rock shows us. And then we know that Moses struck the rock and it split open. So there's another illustration of Jesus. Jesus was stricken in Isaiah 53, 4-6. Jack, you want to get that?
Surely he took up our infirmities and carried our sorrows. Yet we considered him stricken by God, smitten by him and afflicted. But he was pierced for our transgressions. He was crushed for our iniquities. The punishment that brought us peace was upon him, and by his wounds we are healed. We all like sheep have gone astray. Each of us has turned to his own way, and the Lord has laid on him the iniquity of us all.
So Joshua and we can learn that wherever God takes us, he will provide for us. And he can provide us life abundantly, and it is through Christ. And there's an illustration of it. Okay, so that takes us up to Rephidim. And at Rephidim, there was this battle. Looking from the ridge up here, we're actually standing on the ridge of Mount Sinai, what I think is Mount Sinai, Jebel al-Lawz. Looking down, that is the rock. So you can see it's on that side. They would have been living on that side. And that's not an easy trek. To go around the mountain was almost 50 miles. But they were around this rock with water coming out and going who knows where. And this is where Amalek attacked them. Okay, and we pick up the story, chapter 17 of Exodus, verses 8 and 9.
The Amalekites came and attacked the Israelites at Rephidim. Moses said to Joshua, "Choose some of our men and go out to fight the Amalekites. Tomorrow I will stand on top of the hill with the staff of God in my hands."
Okay, Josephus tells us that the women and the children and the old people and so forth were all gathered around this hill, and a section of the army was used to protect them. Now Moses, we can imagine, was up top of this, and down in the valley, Joshua would have fought with the Amalekites. And it says that he would observe from a hill nearby, and when he lifted his hands, they prevailed. And when he dropped them, they did not. What is lifting your hands a symbol of? Praise and?
Not submission.
Submission? No, and that's what I'm thinking. How many people do this when they're praying? In the old days, that's how you pray. You didn't pray like this, like we do. You opened your hands. A lot of people do that today. You know, when we pray for Len, and he's teaching back there, he's always got his hands like this. We lift holy hands in prayer.
And also victory, I see.
And victory, true, yeah. Okay, so what does that all mean to Joshua? Remember, Joshua had all kinds of evidence that God could fight a great battle. A lot of times people say, well, the battle is the Lord's. That's the message here. No. The Lord's battle must be joined is the message here. You see, when Moses is standing in front of the Red Sea, then God says to him, you just stand still and see what I'm going to do. And aside from waving his staff or during the plagues telling Pharaoh what he was going to do, Moses and the Israelites didn't have a whole lot of influence on the outcome, did they? God did what he was going to do. And sometimes he does that, but sometimes he actually asks us to get down in the valley and fight. The battle is the Lord's, but the battle must be joined. Joshua had to fight, and Moses had to uphold him in prayer, and it makes a difference. And this is a pattern that becomes more and more prevalent in sacred history. There are some times when God does mighty deeds like causing the walls of Jericho to fall down. But the people of God are more and more and more a part of the struggle, and we have to operate by faith. So Joshua needs to know that he has to act with faith, in courage, in obedience to God's will, if God is to give him the victory, even though the Lord is the one who commands the battle. How does that apply to you? There's a paradox, isn't there? God is sovereign. Man has free will and responsibility. And I don't care how much we argue about it, we will never resolve that this side of eternity. God is in control, and yet we are asked to participate. There's a verse that says in Psalm 127:1, except the Lord build the house. You know that song? The builders labor in vain. Unless the Lord watches over the city, the guards stand watch in vain. Well, what does it mean that the Lord builds the house and the laborers build the house? Same problem, right? The Lord guards the city, but the soldiers guard the city. God will protect you and your family, but you must also protect you and your family. So Joshua had to fight if God was to deliver the victory, but also there's a heavenly aspect to this struggle, and Moses had to pray, and it matters. We have all these prayer requests up here, and I trust most of us spend some time during the week praying for one another. Is that because this is making us feel good? Or do we believe that there is a God who actually hears and actually can be moved? I don't understand this. God is inscrutable. He is eternal. He is unchanging. And yet when I pray, he can change things. Don't ask me to understand that. But nevertheless, prayer is important. It's illustrative of that pair of things called justification and sanctification. God saves us by a mighty act of grace. Then he calls us to holy lives and asks us to jump into the arena and engage in a struggle with sin and temptation, right? In Ephesians chapter 6, we are told, here's the armor of God, put it on. But what does it say after the armor of God is put on? It says, praying always with all prayer and supplication in the Spirit. The armor of God's important. The helmet of salvation, the breastplate of righteousness, and feet shod with the preparation of the gospel of peace and so forth. But isn't it also true that we are to be praying all times with prayer and supplication to God? Now, Now, he built an altar. And this actually is a pile of stones that looks a little bit like an altar, very close to that, just a few hundred yards away from that rock. So maybe that's the altar that they built, or what's left of it. It's hard to say. But in that, he says something that's very controversial. Exodus 17, 14 to 16, Jack.
Then the Lord said to Moses, write this on a scroll as something to be remembered and make sure that Joshua hears it, because I will completely blot out the memory of Amalek from under heaven. Moses built an altar and called it the Lord is my banner. He said, for hands were lifted up to the throne of the Lord. The Lord will be at war against the Amalekites from generation to generation.
Wow. Later in Deuteronomy 25, he says, you shall blot out the name of Amalek from under heaven. I will be at war against Amalek from generation to generation. 400 years later, Saul is told to wipe out a certain segment of the Amalekites completely. And God says, it's because of what they did back here to my people. Does that make you uncomfortable? It does to me. I've had a hard time with this lesson because of that very thing. And it's very controversial. Matter of fact, Dave Moyson wrote a song that he performed. It talks about Jesus as warrior. And he took a ton of criticism for that. Oh, no, not my God. My God is a God of love. Well, I'm sorry, but God is also a God of war. In Revelation, I'm going to have to accelerate here. Revelation 19, 11 to 16, we see Jesus returning. Go ahead, Jack. Can you read that for me, 11 to 16 and 19 to 21?
I saw heaven standing open, and there before me was a white horse, whose rider is called Faithful and True. With justice he judges and makes war. His eyes are like blazing fire, and on his head are many crowns. He has a name written on him that no one knows but he himself. He is dressed in a robe dipped in blood, and his name is the Word of God. The armies of heaven were following him, riding on white horses and dressed in fine linen, white and clean. Out of his mouth comes a sharp sword with which to strike down the nations. He will rule them with an iron scepter. He treads the winepress of the fury of the wrath of God. On his robe and on his thigh he has this name written, King of Kings and Lord of Lords.
That's your gentle Jesus. You see? We forget some things, like God destroyed all the people of the world and all the land-dwelling animals in the flood for their wickedness. And he promises that one day he will return. And it says all the armies of the world will be gathered against him, and with a single word, he will kill them all. Kill them all. The word kill is in there. Boy, that's genocide, isn't it? I think we just need to remember that there is a cosmic war that is going on. It is in areas many times that we can't see, but it also bleeds down into areas we can see. We are involved because Adam fell under the dominion of Satan, and God is rescuing us. But that is a titanic struggle. There's a great passage given by Harry Blameyers in his book, The Christian Mind. And I wish I could do it all. There's some ellipses in here, but just to give you a flavor of what he says, Jack, would you read this slide for me?
On the one hand is the assumption that all is over when you die, that in worldly prosperity and well-being lies the source of all meaning and value. On the other hand is the almost crushing awareness of a spiritual war tearing at the heart of the universe, pushing its way into the lives of men, that we are always responsible, always at war, always involved in what is spiritual and deathless, that we are committing ourselves with every breath to salvation or damnation.
A Chinese Christian was asked, what do you think the difference is between American Christians and Chinese Christians? And he answered, you Americans don't know you're at war.
Yes, we do now.
We do now, huh? Yeah. Now think about it for a minute. If God were not at war with his enemy, what hope would there be for you and me? If God were not at war with our enemy, what hope would we have? We've got to remember, this is a war of rescue and restoration. And God is rescuing us, and he is rescuing his creation. Lastly, God is a God of vengeance. We don't have a lot of time to spend on this, but it does say that I will completely erase the memory of the Amalekites. I will be at war against the Amalekites from generation to generation. You shall blot out the name of Amalek, for their hands were lifted to the throne of God. Amalek, you see, just did what Amalek does, but in so doing, they were threatening and attacking the means, that is the nation of Israel, by which God would one day send the Redeemer that was promised in Genesis 3:16. And God will accomplish his salvation, and anybody who gets in the way of that is his enemy. Alvin?
God is not capricious. When he told Abraham, I'm going to give you this land, he also said, you have to wait a while, but he said, the cup of the Amorite is not yet full. He did not pour out his wrath on Amorites until he had to.
Mm-hmm. So God is also a God of vengeance. We ought to take a look at chapter 32 of Deuteronomy, verse 39.
See now that I myself am he. There is no God beside me. I put to death and I bring to life. I have wounded and I will heal, and no one can deliver out of my hand.
The point is this, God's vengeance, and he is a God of vengeance. Remember, we think of the passage that says, do not take revenge, for the Lord says, vengeance is mine, saith the Lord. And what we look at is the do not take revenge yourself, meaning your personal revenge. But we forget the fact that God will take revenge. He will avenge every evil. He will take care of every wrong. It is rooted in his absolute holiness and his justice. It begins with punishments and rewards on this life as we see it illustrated, but it also extends into eternity. Now, God's vengeance can be temporal, carried out of specific people and places in this life. Sometimes sin is its own reward, but it will ultimately be final and eternal. All accounts will be completely settled. And at the end, God's project for our redemption will be finished. One of the most comforting verses to me is Revelation 22:11, and it says, let him who is evil, who does evil, continue to do evil. Let him who is vile continue to be vile. But let him who does good continue to be good. And I'm not quoting it approximately. And him who is righteous continue to be righteous. What he's saying at the very end is that there is ultimately a separation between the wicked and the righteous. And the righteous will never again fall into sin. Does that comfort you? That comforts me no end. I am so tired of wrestling with my sins. And God will one day make me the righteous, as it says in 2 Corinthians 5, big 28, it says, He who knew no sin was made sin for us. Why? That we might be made the righteousness of God in him. To me, that is the greatest attraction of eternity in heaven. The righteous and the wicked will be separated forever. Let me just ask you a quick question as we close. Is God cruel and unfair? We're going to wrestle with this because he's ordering the destruction of whole cities, whole people. Well, let me leave you with just a couple thoughts on that. We can't apply our present day standards of warfare to these passages and try to pass judgment upon God. I mean, even if we did, if God is a God who is cruel and genocidal, then that's who he is. I mean, there's nothing we can do about that. But he's not. He is just in everything he does. And we should be careful about criticizing Moses and Joshua for what they did and David for what he did when we consider what we do in our own forms of warfare. Nuclear warfare is a terrifying thing, isn't it? Hiroshima, Nagasaki, the Dresden bombing, the bombing of Berlin, all those things didn't distinguish between civilian or military. We slaughtered hundreds of thousands of people. And so be careful before you start criticizing the life of Joshua. Secondly, the giver and the sustainer of life is the one who has the right to take it. And then lastly, God deals with men as nations and families, and he also deals with them as individuals. Remember, Jericho was under the ban. God said you were to destroy every man, woman, and child in Jericho. But he didn't. He saved Rahab and her family. Everybody she could get from her family in that little apartment, he saved them. So God will wreak justice on nations. He will protect and save the individual who believes in him. And there is your comfort, right? Yes, do we deserve great punishment as a nation? Yes, we do. And we are likely to suffer as a result. But he also deals with us as individuals. So we have to trust that, again, every wrong will be avenged. God's justice will be perfectly vindicated. And if we just can't quite understand all that, we need to remember we don't have visibility into the mind of God or the hearts of men.